I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Good morning. I'm Howard Husick. I'm the Vice President of the Manhattan Institute. It's my pleasure to be here this morning to introduce our conference on the importance of building a national electricity distribution grid, and especially to introduce our senior fellow, Peter Huber, author of the paper entitled The Million-Volt Answer to Oil, which is the cornerstone for today's conference. First, permit me a few words about the Manhattan Institute for those of you who may not be familiar with us. We're a policy research institute based in New York, and our interests are national in scope. They include a wide range of domestic policy issues, from health care to housing, tort reform to policing practices. Of late, we have a special interest, as many concerned in public life do today, with infrastructure, and this conference is part of a series of similar conferences and research projects on both transportation and energy infrastructure. This morning's conference is a product of our Center for Energy Policy and the Environment, a center whose name reflects its underlying principle, that it is both possible and crucial for the United States to find ways to reconcile our mission to protect the environment with the need to meet our ever-increasing demand for the energy which fuels our economic growth and prosperity. The man who has served as the guiding intelligence for our center is our main speaker this morning, Peter Huber. In both his books, Hard Green and The Bottomless Well, co-authored with Mark Mills, he's made the case that environmental stewardship need not come at the cost of growth and prosperity. His paper this morning grows most directly out of The Bottomless Well, subtitled The Twilight of Fuel, the Virtue of Waste, and Why We Will Never Run Out of Energy. It traces the history of energy consumption and argues that technological innovation can serve as the antidote to scarcity, and historically has. It's received wide acclaim, garnered praise, for instance, from Bill Gates, who describes it as the only book I've ever seen that really explains energy, its history, and what it will be like going forward. Following Peter's presentation, we'll hear from a distinguished panel, moderated by Stephen Hayward of the American Enterprise Institute, which will discuss the ways and means through which the idea of a national electricity grid might be realized. And finally, we're pleased to provide this forum for our closing speaker this morning, former New York Governor George Pataki, who will reflect on the political challenges we face in balancing growth in energy supply with environmental protection. I turn now to Peter Huber, as I said, a senior fellow at the Institute and a regular contributor to our quarterly City Journal. He's the author of 8 books, including, in addition to The Bottomless Well and Hard Green, Galileo's Revenge, Junk Science in the Courtroom, and The Liability Maze and Law and Order in Cyberspace. A regular columnist for Forbes, his work has appeared in the Harvard and Yale Law Reviews, as well as the Wall Street Journal, Science, Regulation, and National Review. Peter's a graduate of the Harvard Law School, holds a doctorate in mechanical engineering from MIT. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Huber.
Well, to get some perspective on how big the grid is, start perhaps here. If you cast your mind back to breakfast when you opened your apple strudel Pop-Tart and popped it in the toaster, the muscle behind that plug, the existing infrastructure behind it, the stuff already built and out there, can also power almost all the miles you drive in your SUV without even breaking a sweat. Idle capacity, unused capacity in the system could, if connected directly to the wheels of our cars, provide just about all the miles we drive in our passenger cars. Boost output of the power plants, generate about 10% more electricity, and you could, in addition to that, displace just about all the oil-fired residential heat in the country with electric-powered heat. And by the way, you could do this at a price in our cars. We would get miles that gasoline engines could match only on gasoline priced well under $1 a gallon. And in our residential homes, at least off-peak electric prices, which are the prices you would get at night when you're heating most of the time, the electric heat would readily beat $4 a gallon heating oil. Electricity, not oil, is in fact the heart of our energy economy. not in dollar terms. In dollar terms, roughly at the moment, at $100 a barrel, we're spending about $700 billion a year on oil in the United States. We are spending a mere $350 billion, half that, on retail electricity. So in dollar terms, we tend to think and worry and focus more on oil. But in energy terms, we pour as much raw energy into the electric grid as we get from all the oil that gushes into our cars and trucks and planes and chemical plants and factories and home furnaces. And as much raw energy into the grid as into the entire oil economy, and because our power plants that power the grid, that transform that raw energy into power at the plug, because they operate so much more efficiently than the small engines and furnaces that use the oil, we actually get at least twice as much useful power out of that raw fuel when we pour it through the grid. We have, in fact, today a 7-11 energy economy. I think these are the two most important words in our energy economy, and almost nobody knows them, 7 and 11. We consume about 7 billion barrels of oil a year in the United States, and we consume about 11 billion barrels of oil equivalent. In other words, the same amount of raw energy, but not bought in the form of oil. We get about 11 from coal, gas, uranium, hydroelectric dams, a little bit of wind, a few other renewables. So 7 and 11, two numbers. We generate almost all of our electricity from the fuels on the not oil side of the ledger. There's almost no oil in our electrical economy today. Electric power plants consume about half, a bit more than half of all the not oil fuels. The electricity is made in America. We have abundant supplies and reliable access to all the fuels we currently use to generate electricity. When we import them, when we do import some of them, they come from rather stable, reliable partners like Canada and Australia. And wind and solar and other renewables, which are overwhelmingly, by the way, electric alternatives. They're not I have not forgotten ethanol, but ethanol aside, these are largely alternatives that generate electricity that don't directly provide liquid fuels or motive power. Moreover, the center of gravity of our energy economy continues to shift south. In fact, it has been shifting south toward the electric side essentially since the day that Thomas Edison deployed his first jumbo generator in Manhattan and began to light up Wall Street. But that process has continued for well over a century now. Electricity, which of course is an intermediate form of energy, but nevertheless a form of energy, steadily displacing non-electric fuels in the places where we actually use them. About 60% of our GDP now comes from services that run entirely on electricity. All of the fastest growing sectors of the economy, information technologies and telecom and much of the service sector run entirely on electricity. More than 85% of the growth in U.S. energy demand since 1980 has been met at the consumer end of things by electricity. Electrification has been propelled not by government mandates or subsidies, quite the contrary, in fact, but by this process, this relentless process of electrifying our energy economy has been driven by market forces and rapid innovation in technology that sort of draw electricity and produce other stuff like motion and radiant heat in our toasters and bits and pulses of light that race around the world. In factories and refineries, electrically powered microwave ovens and lasers and welders and dryers are steadily, relentlessly, step by step, continue to displace gas and oil-fired ovens and furnaces because electrically fired sources of heat, like the microwave oven in your kitchen, tend to be more precise, cheaper, more accurate, more compact, and cleaner, at least at the point where you're using them. Even more significantly, and much in the news, but I still think seriously underappreciated, the car is now, step by relentless step, being transformed into a giant electric appliance. And I don't want to be misquoted on any of this because I agree with only half of the green story here, not the whole one. Plug-in hybrids are most certainly coming. They are coming fast. I will tell you personally that at some point in the next decade or two, however green or ungreen you are, you personally will be driving around in a giant electric appliance, a sort of 2-ton Cuisinart. Not simply because these plug-in hybrids are run cleaner or more efficiently, though they are clean and efficient, but because these electrical drivetrains can and will deliver better performance, less weight, and in due course, cheaper cars. They aren't here yet, but that is the clear direction of things. How do I know? I'm really good at predicting the future that has already happened. The locomotives, if you rode Amtrak today, you were riding in a diesel-electric locomotive was pulling you. It is a giant electrical appliance with a diesel generator stuck at one end, and that is generating electricity that drives the wheels and everything else. Most of our Navy now runs on non-plug-in hybrids. I mean, they are electric drivetrains. Nuclear submarines have been doing this for decades. The giant trucks that are used for mining coal and so on, you've seen them. They're about as high as this room. They are an electrical generator, basically a diesel genset sitting in the middle, and then all the rest of the drivetrain is electric. Why? I mean, was this the NRDC that forced this? No, it's good engineering. It's good technology. It is the way of the future because electrical technologies are making breathtakingly fast advances in taking power and converting it into motion and into radiating power and lasers and so forth. And with this transition, and once you make this transition, these cars will have on board battery packs. Today's battery packs will get you perhaps 5 miles on the battery alone. And as this technology evolves, these battery packs will become 30 to 50 mile battery packs. The vast majority of trips that people take are shorter than that. Cars sit idle in the parking lot most of the day, and therefore the stage is set for this convergence, very important convergence between the transportation and electrical sectors, or the light duty, the light duty sector of our transportation system and the electric sector. This means that without any new flash of genius from Washington, we are getting better and better at using electricity as a substitute for oil. As I say, this is a process that has been underway for over a century, and it is, if anything, accelerating. But we're not talking about anything gee whiz brand new. It is happening. Curiously, however, so the electricity for oil displacement we keep getting better at. Curiously, we are not very good yet in this country at using electricity as a substitute for electricity. And that is really what I would like to talk about next. Here's what I mean. We are very good at using oil as a substitute for oil, too good, in fact. Oil is very portable. That's why we use it in our transportation sector. But its portability is also our biggest problem. If it's light enough to run your Buick, it's also light enough to ship to Paris or Shanghai to run a Citroën or a Hongqi red flag SUV. And that inevitably means that, even if we extract all our oil from U.S. wells, its price will remain tied to a price set by the global market. It's just the nature of the stuff we're talking about. And unless we simply are prepared to shut ourselves off from the rest of the world, what we pay for oil will remain linked to KGB oligarchs and feudal theocracies and tin pot dictators all around the globe. It's just the nature of the stuff we're talking about. Our electricity, by contrast, is not even national. It is far from our electricity market. We don't have anything close to even a U.S. market for electricity. Our electricity markets are local, regional. They are terribly fragmented. The oil market, the oil tanker, what is the oil tanker for electricity? It's the electric grid. And the grid is nominally split into three regions, one west of the Rockies, one east of the Rockies, and Texas, being Texas, has a grid all of its own. They are hardly connected at all. Even the regions that look connected to each other aren't, not really. There are nominal links from Kansas to Florida. They're all in the eastern interconnection, but we don't wheel much power over those distances at all for a variety of reasons. It just doesn't happen. Because of this fragmentation, somewhere in America, somebody is always offering electricity for sale at a price 20 to 50% lower than people are paying somewhere else in the country. The average retail price for electricity is about 9 cents a kilowatt hour. Peak wholesale prices, this is stuff actually offered for sale, vary from 1 to 3 cents across the country at any given moment of the day. And several hours later in the day, the cheap sellers and the expensive buyers have often traded places because demand moves from east to west as the sun moves across the country and as the weather changes and as human activity rises and falls in the course of the day. Price zones in the electricity market track time zones and weather zones. A few other things too. There are political zones, structural zones. There's more to it than this, but those are very dominant factors, those two, time zones and weather zones. At many hours of the day, there are utilities in the country just straining, desperately straining, particularly in summer, to maintain the voltage in their wires, while just a third of the continent away, which isn't all that far, as we shall see, there are others with capacity standing idle. Every utility nominally aims to maintain about a 15% cushion in generating capacity, so it always has a little bit more than it's going to get on the hottest summer day when the air conditioners are humming. And yet, year-round, on average, just 24/7 for the whole year, about over half of all our generating capacity simply sits idle. It's a huge capital investment, much of the time not used. And over the course of that same year, 1/5 of the electricity we generate is generated with very expensive fuel, when there are much cheaper fuels available, but somehow the economics don't work out for using them to generate electricity about 1/5 of the time. Finally, and this is important, for many people, levels of interest vary, but the electric grid today, take this as an absolute, certain, definite engineering fact, cannot handle significant amounts of wind or solar power in its present configuration. If I simply gave you free enough windmills and erected them all to generate 20% of our electricity with windmills and said, go to it, folks, and you plug them into the grid, you would begin blowing ginormous fuses all over the place every time the wind picked up or set down. The infrastructure simply is not there. These cables need steady stuff in them. When things fluctuate too much, fuses blow. It's quite dramatic. This grid-determined fragmentation of our electricity market makes electricity much more expensive than it could be. In this, the age of everybody has freakonomics or wikinomics. Let us call this ficklenomics. The economic bottom line with electricity is that fickle is expensive and steady is cheap. And I mean, there's a big gap between fickle and steady. If we could pool everything, I mean, do this thought experiment. If we could aggregate all of the supply side of our electric market, all the generation, at one end of the wire somewhere or other, and if we could aggregate all the demand at the other end of the wires, thought experiment for now, and thus turn all the fickle peaks and valleys of supply and demand to much, much more stable, level demand around the clock. If we could, in other words, in the jargon of the industry, turn everything into base load power or close to it, we would cut the average price of electricity somewhere between 30% and 50%. I mean, it would have a dramatic impact. This is a profoundly important fact about our energy economy, because this is the biggest piece of our energy economy. Again, if producers could freely choose to build power plants where it makes the most sense to build them, if every power plant could be sited where land is cheap, where the immediate neighbors at least welcome the investment, where coal or uranium or gas or wind or sun is most readily available, where you are least likely to damage important ecosystems or ruin the scenery, and therefore least likely to see the costs mushroom when the lawyers pile on. If all our plants could be built where conditions make pollution control systems most affordable, if you could do all that and simply puke out from any one plant 500 or 1,000 megawatts of power 24/7 every day of the year, knowing that the wire will somehow deliver that power to 500 or 1,000 megawatts of rock-steady load at the other end of the wire, if every power plant could be built and operated that way, then once again, you just about half the cost of electricity, or at the very least cut the cost 40%. Or in other words, the close to half the cost of electricity depends on three very simply articulated facts. Demand is fickle, supply is fickle. The market demands, absolutely insists on rock-steady voltage in the wires themselves. And it's squaring that problem that creates enormous expense today and opportunity tomorrow. It brings us to this. I thank AEP for giving this to me. I shall try and persuade you in the next few minutes that this is the most valuable technology in our entire energy economy, and here I have it right in my hand. It has done more to lower the cost of electricity lower the cost of the energy we use across our energy economy, and raise efficiency. This technology has done more to do all that. Smaller versions are the same. Sometimes you just have a thinner wire. But to lower cost and raise efficiency than all the improvements made in our car engines since Henry Ford rolled out the Model T. And I don't make this up. It's quite easily proved, in fact. This is eBay for energy. This is what lets you shop online for coal, gas, uranium, water behind a dam, wind, wood, and sun. It allows you to buy fuel by the smidgen and to rent $1 billion, million horsepower turbine by the millisecond with high voltage technology that's already quite widely used today. One wire like this, a cable this fat, no fatter, moves enough power to propel 3 Boeing 747 jets at altitude at 500 miles an hour. You can put a lot of energy down one of these. And again, this is not technology I'm about to invent in 30 years if Washington gives me money. It's up and running today. Now, if we can show this in a bundle, do we have a... I don't have many of these. Grand total 3. These are these wires in a bundle of 6 circuits on an actual operating line today, quite common. You have to know the difference between your lines. These are the nice new ones. They're very good. A complete line like this flies 55 jumbo jets at 500 miles an hour at altitude. I mean, I'm talking in energy terms, power terms. Or if you will, if you want to put it in national terms, one line like this with 3 bundles, you can see the other 2 off on the side, one line like this can move about 1%, which I find to be a staggeringly big number, about 1% of the total average U.S. electric load can be pumped down one such line. The technology for running lines at these voltages, they run at close to 1 million volts peak, or if you want to get technical, at a 765,000 volts root mean square. That technology is relatively new. Okay? These are much higher voltages than people were deploying even 10, 20 years ago, and certainly far higher than was imagined before that, and therefore much higher than is running on most of our electric grid today. The technology is relatively new. It is stunningly efficient in both electrical and economic terms. It's a narrow footprint. They've shrunk these things down, about 200-foot right-of-way or something like that, and they're putting just enormous amounts of energy down them. And that means, for the first time in history, we can and should be seriously thinking about this. And this is the last slide. So, you know, we have the technology. It's running today. Should we choose to, we can build a national electricity market. Take, as a starting point, I mean, to knit the country together, about 22,000 miles of backbone high-voltage grid overlaid on the existing fragmented grids. Such a grid would move about 25% of our current electricity market, our current average electricity consumption. It would move it over distances spanning significant fractions of the continent, routinely move it 1,000 miles or more, and in some of the numbers that follow, I'm typically thinking about a 1,000-mile average transit for power, which is a good distance. It's a lot more than we routinely move it today. It would cost about $75 billion to build. It would which would add about 1/3 of a penny, 0.3 cents or so, 0.4 perhaps, per kilowatt hour to the retail price of electricity if averaged over all the kilowatt hours. And by pooling supply and demand, it would most certainly lower the average price of electricity by significantly more than 0.3 cents per kilowatt hour. Why should we believe in such a big economic impact? I sketch out the numbers in the paper I've prepared. People are forever sketching out numbers in this city, and most of them are just sheer garbage. But these numbers are right. They're not hard to verify in practice, but to do it really accurately, you have to run big models of a national electric economy, and you have to track out time zones and weather things. These databases exist, and you know, my challenge to anybody who is skeptical is take it to the next stage. There are excellent modeling people who do this, but I think the back of the envelope and the rough calculations are right, and I'd like to just put them to you. And if I'm wrong, somebody will prove me wrong, but I'm not. These are actually what they look like. Wire lowers, enough wire, this stuff lowers the cost of fuel. Now, I'm going to say this at risk of being misunderstood. The backbone transmission line is relatively cheap, the really high capacity stuff I showed you a moment ago. But wires, the distribution lines, the low voltage stuff that runs through the cities and so on is quite expensive. And an interesting fact, rather hard to believe, but wire lowers the cost of the fuel. We are spending more today on wires than the fuel costs us in coal plants, uranium plants, and nuclear plants. Okay, gas fuel costs us more than the wire does, but for about 80% of the electricity we consume, the wire costs, the local distribution costs, in fact, are higher than the cost of the fuel. Why would we be spending so much on the wire? Because it lowers the cost of the fuel. Basically, wire lets you smooth out demand and therefore lets you capture price spreads. Price spreads tied to fuel costs alone, this is basically between gas-fired plants and the rest, run about 5 cents per kilowatt hour or more. Okay? Moving 20% of our power across a 5-cent price spread would cut our electricity bill by about 10% directly. I mean, that's just how wire works. Then wire also significantly reduces the cost of capital. Again, gas-fired plants aside, most of the price of electricity is in the capital, part of it in the wires and part of it in the power plants. These are huge billion-dollar structures, these big power plants, and that capital is very expensive, and you pay for it whether it's running or not. Basically, wire lets you fill all the seats in the jumbo jet. You're not flying this capital with half the seats empty. You're using it full-time because you're pooling a lot of demand. And again, you get a very substantial impact on the average cost of electricity by, as I say, filling your jumbo jet, electrically speaking, by using the capital very efficiently. Again, the numbers, you look at them, and I sketch some of them out in the paper, but you're talking 1 to 2 cents on the average price of electricity because our capital assets are idle over half the time in this country. Our aggregate generating assets are so often idle. Beyond lower costs of capital and fuel, there is a snowball effect, and I just want to get through this very quickly. Building out a backbone grid will accelerate electrification, the process I was describing early, out of our entire energy economy. And the more you electrify, the more you smooth out supply and demand, and you get further downward pressure on prices. In most markets, ordinary markets, you know, demand goes up, prices go up. In the electricity market, for sure, as in the airline market, if demand goes up at the right time, prices go down because you are using assets that would otherwise be idle. And if you begin, I mean, the two things I sketched out earlier, if you begin electrifying your transportation sector overwhelmingly at night, and if you begin pushing residential heat into the electrical sector, again, overwhelmingly at night and in winter when there is a great deal of spare capacity in the electrical system, you boost use of these capital assets. And once again, from just this process of electrification, as you put in place a grid that ties it all together, if you give people access to the cheapest power, I did the numbers for my house in New Hampshire where oil prices are sky high. Even at New Hampshire's ridiculously inflated prices, and I'm maybe the only person in town who spends his days doing this, but even at these ridiculous prices, with a stupid resistance heater, I can begin beating the oil prices there, and certainly with a heat pump, I beat them easily. And if New Hampshire or anybody else had any sense and pushes off-peak electric prices in the right direction, you push down the cost of electricity, the price of electricity across the board, because you're using idle wires and idle capital that otherwise is simply generating no revenues at all. All of these savings, it's often suggested, look, if you knit markets together and begin connecting the people who have the Hoover Dam in their backyard with, people like in New York and California who don't want anything in their backyard and, and pay a price for it, I might add, then the people who have the Hoover Dam will lose. That can happen if you do it wrong, but, trading done right always creates surpluses, and there are always regulatory mechanisms that share the surplus, that create benefits at both ends. And I would emphasize that for people who see it as paramount importance to push the environmental end of electricity, I sincerely believe that it is by capturing this kind of economy and this kind of opportunity here, by integrating the electric market, you will create the opportunity to get very much more efficient than we currently are at abating environmental impacts by moving demand or connecting the demand to the lowest cost supply, with cost now, of course, defined to include whatever environmental objectives you're trying to promote. Finally, let me throw out some oil numbers here. And again, in this town, I've heard so many of them, and I tire of hearing them. People are always promising to get over oil, right? That buy my widget, and we're going to solve the oil problem. I am at an advantage here because I am trying to sell or persuade you that we ought to be using more of what we already have. This widget has already been invented. Electricity is already huge. It is already bigger than oil. It is plausible to talk about electrification and say we can have this kind of impact on the oil market because electricity is already that big, right? If they've got to invent it, you won't see it in your lifetime, right? If it's a matter of developing what's already there, you actually will. The technologies that substitute for electricity for oil are already in place, and they continue to evolve every day. We already generate electricity in quantities huge enough to have a really serious impact on other sectors of the energy economy. Those are the starting point. Okay, just a few numbers quickly. Smooth out demand seen at the power plant, and you basically begin kicking gas out of the electric sector, because gas is the peaker fuel in the electric sector. We use a lot of gas in the electric sector. If you migrate gas out of the electric sector, and Boone Pickens, for reasons that elude me, gets a lot more attention when he says this than I do, but nevertheless, he happens to be right about that, although not about everything. All right. If you push gas out of the electric sector, there's a lot of gas there. The technologies for using gas to power trucks and light-duty fleet vehicles, not light-duty vehicles, and even cars, the gas-fired cars. The technology is there. We already drive lots of buses and trucks on gas. Familiar technology, not very complicated. You are looking at a 20% potential hit. I'm giving you the outer bounds here, 20% hit on our oil market by squeezing gas out of the electric sector and putting it into the transportation sector. Electrifying the heating sector, 15% hit on the oil markets. We use a lot of oil for just raw heat. I'm giving you the outer bounds. Obviously, you don't do it overnight. Electrify the transportation sector, and you're looking at another 30% hit on our total oil market. These are numbers that easily add up to 50% of our oil market. I mean, without breaking a sweat. The biggest one, of course, being the transportation sector, but the cushion shot, moving gas out of electric into the transportation sector, and the heating sectors are large as well. With electricity, we control our own destiny. Its cost depends mainly on the cost of labor, capital, and know-how, which are the most inexhaustible and renewable resources on our planet. The one exception in our electric market is gas that stands out. More grid is doubly essential if you really want to push wind and solar and these very fickle renewables. They simply cannot generate and keep our grid powered up steadily unless they are linked together in large numbers. They are too variable on their own. In large numbers, they can have a substantial impact, and if you knit them together, they can generate power. On our electric side of our energy economy, we are far better off than the countries that worry us the most, either because they have so much oil, but we don't really trust them, or because they buy so much oil and we're frightened that they're going to price us out of the market. Our grid weaned itself from oil almost 30 years ago during the last big oil crunch in the 1980s. Much of the rising demand for oil in China and India and other developing countries can be traced to diesel generators. Basically, they desperately want electricity. They have no grid. They have no nothing. So they take essentially a truck engine, they fire it up, and they begin generating local electricity. They are scrambling to electrify that way and to string together their very first grid. We are at the opposite, the far end of that process. We have a lot of grid in place, but as they deploy truck engines to generate electricity, we are focusing correctly on using electricity to displace truck engines, so to speak, to move beyond oil-fired systems. Japan has very good reason to focus so heavily on hybrids. They have nothing but nuclear electricity in their energy economy, in their homegrown energy economy. India and China, at present, will be firing up a coal in a nuclear facility about once a week for the next 25 years or so. The rest of the world will catch up to where we are now, and they will then wire their energy economies as fast as they possibly can, generally without much concern about environmental impacts. Attempting to spell out exactly what mix of generating technologies and fuels we ought to be using over the next 30 years, I think is a largely futile exercise. The technologies will change and evolve. We are taking environmental factors into consideration that we didn't used to, so there will be a lot of action there. The grid is the one completely unifying, technology-neutral, fuel-neutral stock exchange in our energy economy. We should turn this into a serious national market on the double. I mean, basically, to get over $4 gas, we should let American capital and labor and know-how and ingenuity do what it already does so well and connect us to the 4-cent electricity. Thank you.
For questions. If you wait for the microphone and then identify yourself by name and affiliation when you give questions. Over here on the right.
Hi, Tina Seeley with Bloomberg News. Who builds this backbone grid, and what does the federal government need to do to get it done?
Well, the people who actually build grid are already out there. They build it every day, okay? The big challenge, I think, is actually finding a government authority that will simply create an economic and regulatory environment where the capital will come. $75 billion, you know, sounds like serious money, but for this industry, this is pretty small potatoes, actually. It's a third of a cent on the average kilowatt hour of electricity. You know, there are utilities who will build this. There are independent investors who will do this. They need a regulatory environment in which they can actually know they can get rights of way end to end, and in which they know that they will be able to set prices and bill appropriate people at the far end. I do not think this requires direct outlays from Washington at all. Probably not a penny, as far as perhaps for some rural areas, but not otherwise. What it needs is a regulatory authority. If you want the analogy, what we need for electricity is roughly what we have for gas pipelines, okay? We already have national authority there. We need it for electricity.
Over here.
Margaret Ryan, I'm with Clean Skies TV News. There certainly has been a lot of discussion of rethinking the grid from a national level, but the problem is the grid structure itself is actually regulated in large part in all 50 states with some overlay from FERC. What changes in the regulatory system would you recommend to get this a grid like this built?
They boil down to two. I mean, one is the land use issue. You have to be able to have authority. It is no use building, you know, a grid to nowhere, right? I mean, if you start, you've got to finish. You have to have connected both ends. So you have to, if you want to build, say, 1,000-mile piece, you actually have to know that you're going to get authority over that 1,000 miles. You can't build two 499-mile pieces and have 2 miles in the middle that you simply can't connect. So you're basically zoning and land use issues. The Congress already took a step on this a couple of years ago, saying, well, gee, if the stuff is about to melt down, you know, if we're really about to, I simplify, but if, you know, we're about to collapse completely, then the feds can preempt if the states can't get together. I think that is far too timid a criterion, but you need more of that. So you've got a land use thing. You've got to be able to cite this stuff. These things, by the way, their footprints are getting narrower all the time. They really are. It's astonishing how much power you can put in how little space. But there's a land use issue. And then you need, and this gets outside my area of expertise, although I have some in it, but we're about to have a very good panel on this that will amplify on this. You need people who can think through. I'm not saying pay for it from Washington, but at least think through how you set in place economic structures that will let the stakeholders pay for this. Ultimately, ratepayers pay for all the electricity. This is not, at least not a very directly subsidized industry. There's all sorts of argument about environmental indirect subsidies and so on, but this is not a, people are paying their way for this stuff, as they generally are with gasoline. So the issue isn't whether people will pay. I personally will gladly pay half a cent for transmission of electricity if I can buy the power itself for 2 cents less. I mean, most people will if the choice is in those terms. And that is and similarly with the environmental objectives. If our top priority is squeezing carbon out and we really want to promote the carbon-free fuels, we will pay a third of a cent or half a cent to do so. And we will get more than a half a cent worth of benefit in environmental progress. But politically, I mean, getting the political structures together to make those decisions, we do not have anything close to that. I mean, FERC nominally does some of that, but not by any means enough.
Patrick Brown from the High Park Group. Currently, there are about 3 dozen interconnections with Canada, and I'm curious to know the electrification on a national scale of the U.S. Do you think that'll have any great impact on imports of electricity from Canada?
I've looked at both Canada, they're also growing with Mexico. Mexico is quite interested in setting up plants. Apparently, their regulations aren't always quite as strict as ours, and they've got a big market just to the north called California. And Canada's a big provider, as you know, I'm sure, on both the East Coast and the West Coast. In the total scheme of things, the numbers are quite small, but Quebec has been very interested in generating hydro, and there's a lot of hydro shipped south and on the West Coast. I would hope that we've got 2 autonomous countries here. I mean, so they can look after their own interests. They've been mutually beneficial on both sides of the border for long times. I personally, I hope this is true for most of us, do not sort of put Canada in the same camp as Saudi Arabia. You know, we have our differences sometimes, but they're pretty reliable long-term relationship here. So this is an opportunity for both countries, I think. And by the way, I think exemplifies the point that this is not a zero-sum game. You put power plants where they're welcome and where you can best manage the environmental and economic aspects, and you ship power where you can't generate easily. And I see nothing wrong with having New York buy Quebec power from northern Quebec. It's a good thing. I mean, I think it ought to be mutually beneficial.
Way in the back. Just wait for the mic.
Monty Umble, Mesa Power Group. Could you talk about where you see opposition to this plan coming from?
Gee, where should I start? Look, actually, I see it in two camps, and it's rare that I find myself trying to be the kind of political moderate in the middle. But anyway, I tell you, from the right, let's start with the right. I think there is a strong sort of visceral reaction with many conservative people whenever you talk about federal power of any kind. They say, you know, we don't like federal power. We'd rather leave this to state and communities. But we didn't do that with the national highway system. We don't do it with the pipelines. We're not doing it with oil, however much we may say otherwise. I mean, energy, there are inherent national and global issues we just have to come to grips with. And I think the right has got the deep right, if you will, the people who are very powerful federalists and have perhaps not thought fully about these problems have to be persuaded there are some issues where you actually need unified national effort and integrated authority, and this happens to be one of them. I think on the left, if you go into the deep background of the Green movement, there was a very deep visceral antipathy to big electricity. I mean, you look at Amory Lovins's earliest papers, and he talked about brittle power. He was radically anti-grid. He just didn't like transmission lines or big power plants. I think that has to be addressed. I think that antipathy is wrong. With the current fuel mix today, all right, with the coal and uranium and gas and hydro we are using in place today, electrification is in almost every instance positive, I mean a good thing in carbon reduction, okay, because the power plants are so much more efficient than the dispersed things. And don't take this on my authority, read the World Wildlife Federation or others. People who have actually bothered to do the numbers are generally reaching that conclusion. And I think people have to be brought around to that. Big centralized systems are sometimes very clean. I mean, bullet trains, and look at transportation. You know, the green side of this debate generally recognizes that for instance, trains can be and buses can be very efficient. Well, they're bigger, they're more centralized, they require, you know, they're not little dispersed things, but sometimes that's the right way to go. And so I think from those two edges you have to get this, and then you have to have, and you know, a lot of local authority. A lot of people just don't like to surrender authority on this, and the one thing that's certain about these things is that they spread across the landscape. That's the point, that's their purpose. You have to get a consensus, a political consensus, and that's hard.
Please join me in thanking Peter.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.